Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. So glad that you're all here. There are about 8 of us here in the sanctuary and at least one person online, and there may be other people who view it online later. So thanks for coming. Need to turn my mic on. Now it's on. All right, let's see. How's that sound? I think it's on. So welcome everybody. We are going to, just as a way of introduction, and I'll say a prayer in just a minute to get us started. But by way of introduction, we had talked about having this for a while, and my original name for it, I think, was Methodist Mashup, because it's going to be about everything Methodist. And then I thought about, I want to talk about Methodist history and Methodist doctrine and Methodist polity. And Angela said, that's too boring. It sounds too boring. Nobody would come to that. And so finally, we arrived on Methodist Moments on the Mount. But we will talk primarily tonight about, it's kind of past, present, and future, I think was one way we described it. Tonight, primarily about the past and Methodist history. Next week, about the present in terms of Methodist beliefs and practices. And the future is going to be mainly about policy, polity, and whatever may be in the future for Methodism, which we do not know yet, but which we have some clues about. So anyway, so thanks for coming. Let's say a prayer as we begin. Thank you, gracious God, for our time together tonight, in person, online, however you unite us. We pray that our time together tonight might be a time of learning, of discussion, of questions and responses, and a time when we learn a little bit more about our Methodist identity, so that we can be more faithful disciples of Jesus. For it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so like I say, tonight is mainly about Methodist history, although those 3 things just kind of bleed into each other. So there's some overlap. So we'll be talking about different things. But when we start thinking about the history of Methodism, how we got to where we are, it's hard to talk about the history of Methodism without beginning with John Wesley. And as you may know, John Wesley was the founder of Methodism. I usually say founder of Methodism, not necessarily the founder of the Methodist Church, because he was a priest in the Church of England, and he remained a priest in the Church of England all of his life. So he really didn't have to do with the Methodist Church. He had to do with Methodism as it started as a reform movement within the Church of England in the 18th century. So John Wesley, born in 1703 in a little town called Epworth, which I think is about 45 minutes northeast of London. And as a child, I spent one summer in England. My whole family did. And so I remember going to Epworth and some of these historic places of Methodism. And we spent the night in a refurbished house that was on the site of the Epworth Rectory where John Wesley was born and lived in his early years. It's a nice big 2-story house. His father, Samuel Wesley, was the rector in Epworth. He was a priest in the Church of England. His mother was Susanna. They were both originally, they did not grow up as members of the Church of England. They were both from dissenter backgrounds, people who dissented from the Church of England, but later as adults chose to become members of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so they got married. John Wesley was like the 16th of 19 children. That's a lot of children. That's not news to you. But the thing about it is only 9 of those children lived past infancy. Unfortunately, there was a high mortality rate for babies at the time. But they had 9 children who lived into adulthood. And anyway, John Wesley's most famous brother, his little brother, was Charles Wesley. And we know him primarily through his hymns. If you look through a Methodist hymnal, you'll see a lot of hymns by Charles Wesley, like "O 4,000 Tongues to Sing," and "Love Divine, All Love's Excelling," and "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," and "Christ the Lord is Risen Today." All these great Wesleyan hymns. And we'll talk a little bit next week when we talk a little bit more about Methodist theology, that a lot of the Methodist theology is sung. It's embedded in Charles Wesley's hymns, as well as in John Wesley's sermons. Most people know Charles Wesley's hymns. We don't know John Wesley's sermons that much because, frankly, it's a whole lot more fun to sing the hymns than to read John Wesley's sermons. Although in his day, he was known as a very lively, engaging preacher, all we have today is just the dry bones of his manuscript, and that doesn't convey the energy or excitement that he brought to his sermons. But anyway, so John and Charles Wesley, both born into the Wesley family in Epworth, England. Susanna really had more to do with the raising of the children than Samuel, the father, did. The father, Samuel, again, was a priest in the Church of England, but he spent a lot of time away. They had these conferences for priests in the Church of England that he used to go to, and he used to spend extra time to. And then part of the time, he was in debtor's prison. So he was away because he couldn't afford to pay his bills. So he spent some time in debtor's prison. So his mother, Susanna, was really more active and involved in the children's lives than Samuel, the father, was. Susanna had a really strict regimen for raising the children. If you got 9 children, or 19 originally, and then 9 who survived past a 1-year-old, you'd have to be, discipline would have to be pretty high on your list. And that idea of discipline and method that John Wesley absorbed in his early childhood, probably before he even remembered it, stuck with him throughout his life. And this sense of orderliness, discipline, organization, method, we see that carries throughout Methodist history. And I think a lot of it started in his childhood and his mother, Susanna. His mother, Susanna, was incredibly educated, especially for a woman at that time. She taught the children Latin and Hebrew and Greek. Just amazing what she taught the children. She had regular times of meeting with the children during the week where she would teach them their prayers, teach them to memorize scripture, teach them basics of grammar and French and Latin and Hebrew. So she spent a lot of time educating the children. I mentioned that Samuel Wesley was away from home a lot, and he was. One of the interesting things about the Wesley household from the beginning is that Susanna Wesley, she would preach to people there in her home. She would have religious gatherings there in the Epworth Rectory. And you see how this affects later Wesleyan development. But when Samuel Wesley was away doing different things, there was what they called a curate, who was like a priest in training, who was supposed to be responsible for the church there in Epworth. But he just didn't seem so out of touch with the people. And the people really felt like they were adrift. They were not receiving any religious instruction or inspiration at all. And some of them came to Susanna. And so she just started leading Bible studies and basically teaching sessions. She didn't call it preaching, but that's almost what they were. Teaching sessions there in the parsonage, in the rectory. And people would come, they'd sit in the house, they'd listen to her, they would open up the windows, people would be outside listening to Susanna teach from the Bible. I mention that because we see that later in Methodist history. John Wesley had an unusually high view of the participation of women in leadership, which was pretty unusual for the 18th century Church of England. But he couldn't help it. His mother, I mean, his mother was so strong an influence in his life that later, when the Methodist Society started coming into existence, and some women came to him and said, "We feel called to preach." Well, this went against the normal practices of the Church of England at the time. But he couldn't help it. He authorized women to preach in the early Methodist meetings. So he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Women in the Methodist Church didn't have full access to clergy ministerial status until 1956 in the United States. And John Wesley never did ordain women, and he never did give them the authority to administer the sacraments or anything like that. So it was not a question of ordaining women, but he did commission them to preach during his lifetime. And I think a lot of that is due to his mother's influence, because he certainly would not have been who he was without his mother's strong influence. When he went away at the age of 12, he went away to charter school in London. And then later, about the age of 17, he went away to school at Oxford in England. And he would correspond with his mother on a regular basis. We don't have any correspondence with him and his father, but we have his correspondence with his mother. And a lot of it was about theological matters. And she was still teaching him even as a young man. So just a huge influence on him. One of the interesting things about John Wesley's childhood is I mentioned that his father Samuel Wesley was away a lot, and he was in debtor's prison sometimes, and he was just he really struggled. And the people of his parish in Epworth, England, they really struggled with his leadership in the church. And anyway, in John Wesley's childhood, one night, the parsonage caught on fire. The rectory, they called it, caught on fire. And they got everybody out, they thought, except for one. And there was one child that was still in the parsonage, still in the rectory. And they saw a silhouette up in the upstairs window of little Jackie. That was what they called John at the time, little Jackie. And they saw his silhouette in the window. And Samuel Wesley wrote that he dropped to his knees and committed his son's soul to God, because he thought surely he was not going to survive. He was going to die in this fire. And indeed, the flames were all around him and the smoke. And but then some people kind of formed a human ladder. They got up on each other's shoulders and just kind of, and they barely got him out of the window just before the house collapsed. And from that moment on, his mother, Susanna, said that he was like a brand plucked from the burning, which is a quote from one of the Old Testament prophets, I think Zechariah. Okay, I can't remember, but and told him that story. And so he kind of grew up with this story from both his parents, that he was like a brand plucked from the burning, and somehow God had a special purpose for saving him, and that he didn't really know what it was, but he grew up with these stories about how he was saved from a fire during his childhood. Anyway, he did later go to Charterhouse School in London in his kind of adolescent years, and then later went to Oxford, I think when he was about 17 years old. And he excelled in his studies because his mother had prepared him so well. But he excelled in his studies. They eventually asked him to be on the learning track to become a fellow in Lincoln College, which was one of the small colleges within Oxford University. And that was a big deal. It kind of gave him almost tenure for life there at Oxford. So he taught there at Oxford for many years. There was one point in his early adulthood where he came back to Epworth to help his father out some. And then by the time he came back to Oxford, after being away for a couple of years, his little brother Charles had been there. And Charles and some others had started this group that they called the Holy Club, the Oxford Holy Club. And it was a group that Charles had started, actually. And it had about 5 or 6 people in it, including George Whitfield and some others. And they just met regularly for Bible study and to hold each other accountable. Have you given to the poor this week? How have you visited the prisons this week? Have you done this? And they would just hold each other accountable to this very, how often have you read your Bible each week? Have you done your prayers each day? Just holding each other accountable to these really rigorous standards, so much so that people began to laugh at them and kind of mock them and said that Oxford Holy Club, they just have a method for everything. So they started calling them Methodists because they had a method for everything. So that name stuck. So John and Charles Wesley were both there at Oxford. They studied hard. They taught in their early adulthood until their early 30s. And but they were profoundly restless, I would say, in their own internal religious life. And they just felt like something was missing. And they would later describe it in terms of they were going through all these outward forms and rituals without feeling what they called the power within. And they didn't sense a close connection to God, but they kept going through all the right motions and rituals and everything. But they were always very sincere and always very devout in their religious observances. Anyway, another big turning point in Wesley's life and in the history of Methodism is that later in what year was the year was this? 1735, so Wesley was like 32. Wesley went on a mission trip to Savannah, Georgia. If you ever go to Savannah, Georgia today, you might see little marquees or statues of John Wesley. They have one place in the middle of Savannah, they have a statue of John Wesley. And so that Savannah was, of course, an English settlement in the colonies during those days. He went there as sort of a missionary to the Indians, he said, and to the colonists who were there in Savannah. But he said, he wrote in his journal one time, I came here to save the Indians, but who will save me? And that was again indicative of his restlessness in his religious life. He spent about 2 years in Savannah. Any of y'all ever been to Savannah? Yeah. You ever seen any of the John Wesley stuff they have around town? A couple of you have, yeah. Anyway, while he was there, and I realize some of y'all already know this, but he was unpopular. He tried to have a romance with a young woman there, one of the colonists, and that turned out to be a complete disaster. He abused his ministerial authority one time. This woman that he had romantic feelings for and he wanted to marry wound up, she got engaged to another man. And when Wesley found out about it, he refused to serve them communion. So not a good example of ministerial conduct there. He didn't say it was because they were gay. He said, he made up some kind of excuse, like you didn't fill out the right forms when you were reserving the church for your wedding or something like that. And so you're in violation of church practice and law, therefore I can't serve you. I mean, so it was ridiculous, really, but that's just an example of his kind of prudishness, or his kind of out of touchness with the common folks in a lot of ways. And eventually he became so, I'll tell you another thing about Wesley during his Savannah days. When he would baptize a child, he would, like there would be a baptismal font, kind of like that, I suppose. But he would pick up the child by the heels and let them kind of scream for a while. And then he'd dip them 3 times head first into the water. And, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, he'd dip them head first into the water while dangling them with their heels and hand them back to the parents and say, so glad to baptize you. Congratulations. And parents usually weren't happy with that. And he was just, eventually he was run out of town. They ran him out of town, and he left in the middle of the night on a ship. And because he feared for his life, people were so kind of put off by him. Anyway, on his way back to England, which was 1737, he was coming back to England. He was on board this ship with a group of Moravians. And a storm at sea came up. Imagine. There was this awful storm at sea. And John Wesley fell over and a whale swallowed him. No, just kidding. There was a storm at sea. And he feared for his life. He really did. But what he noticed was that the Moravians were not troubled at all. They were not panicking like he was. They were just kind of huddled together and singing songs and saying prayers, but just being very calm and just kind of trusting God to take care of them. And their lack of panic and their composure and all of this really left an impression on Wesley. And so when he did get back to England, he wanted to learn more about these Moravians. And he started corresponding with some of them. And the Moravians came from kind of a Lutheran background. And they were very pious, and they were really, even more so than Luther, they were into this sincere religious experience, this personal, heartfelt conversion that they said was so important. And Wesley was interested in that and wanted to learn more about that, and corresponded with the Moravians and sometimes went to meetings with them. And anyway, on May 24th, 1738, John Wesley went to a meeting of these Moravians, the Fetter Lane Society, they called it. And on May 24th, 1738, he wrote in his journal, this was the famous Aldersgate experience, because they were meeting at Aldersgate Street in London. And he said, while somebody was reading from the preface to the book of Romans that Martin Luther had written a couple centuries earlier, he said, I felt I did trust in Christ, and Christ alone for my salvation. And an assurance was given me that Christ had died for me, even me, and saved me from the law of sin and death. And that became known as John Wesley's kind of Aldersgate heartwarming experience. And out of that kind of experience, it kind of re-energized him, because he was basically, after his failure in America, he was depressed. He was, just dejected. And this contact with the Moravians really brought him out of that. And really, that Aldersgate experience was a key turning point in his life. And shortly after that, he gave a sermon called Free Grace, in which he said, God's grace is free in all and free for all. And every one of you, he said, is invited to the table where Christ awaits for you, and God's grace is there for you. God wants relationship with every one of us. God's grace is free. We don't have to do anything to earn it. We just receive it. We accept it, and we live into it. Free grace was the name of the sermon that he preached shortly after that Aldersgate experience. And shortly after that, one of John Wesley's friends from the old Oxford Holy Club days, whose name was George Whitfield. George Whitfield had begun preaching in the fields to hundreds of people at a time. And some of them were like coal miners coming out of the coal mines, and at a time when the Church of England was really viewed as just this really dead, cold place. I try not to be too harsh on them, because a lot of people say, well, you know what the United Methodist Church is now? It's a lot like the Church of England in the 18th century that John Wesley was trying to reform. And I try to keep that in mind. Anyway, but people had really lost touch and confidence. The common folks had in the Church of England of this day. So George Whitfield, his friend from the Holy Club, started just preaching out in the open fields. And he invited Wesley to start doing the same thing. And at first, Wesley was very hesitant to do that, very opposed to do that, because he thought preaching is something you should only do inside the church. And he said so much so that he would have thought it almost a sin to convert somebody outside of the church grounds. But he eventually said, well, maybe I'll give this a try. And he did. And he and Whitfield and then others started preaching out in the open fields, open air. And their preaching was filled with such spirit and vitality that it just drew people. John Wesley, at one point in his journal, said this is what he did. He said, when I start to preach, it's like I light myself on fire and people turn out just to watch me burn. But that gives you an idea of the passion with which he preached. And so lots of people came to hear him preach all over England. Started out in Bristol and moved all over the countryside of England. And when people would be converted under Wesley's preaching, and Wesley had some other colleagues, other Methodist colleagues who were also doing some field preaching. And when they would become converted in those, he would form them into societies. Because here's one of the differences between Wesley and Whitfield. Whitfield was probably a greater preacher, but he would convert them and then say bye and move on to the next town and leave them with nothing, no structure in which to grow. Wesley would preach, many people would be converted, but before he would leave them, he'd get them organized and say, now this is how you need to continue to grow as a Christian. It's more than just getting your ticket punched to go to heaven when you die. He would organize them into classes and bands and societies and accountability groups where they would meet together, where they would do what he called watch over one another in love. And whereas Whitfield would probably have more conversions, but you'd come by 6 months later and there would be nothing to show for it. People were doing pretty much the same thing as before. But when Wesley preached, he would and organized them, the Methodist societies and bands and classes would still remain for years and years and years and decades, and they'd be organized for mission to do good things. They, of course, organized they built orphanages, they built schools, for children. They even had, Wesley was a believer in medicine, the best medicine of the day. Of course, it's nothing like the medicine that we practice now, but he actually wrote a medical textbook and that was probably the best medical textbook of the day. It's as good as anybody else. It's nothing by our standards, but it was, for his day, it was about the best they had. And he organized them in a way that their Christian faith was embodied institutionally to last for years and years and decades and centuries, really. Now, all this time that he was organizing Methodism, Methodism was not a church. It was still within the Church of England. It was a movement within the Church of England. And John Wesley always told people, I'm so glad that you showed up to hear me preach, and you're in these accountability groups during the week. That's wonderful. And you're doing these good things, and you're visiting prisons, and you're ministering to the poor, and you're starting orphanages and starting schools for children, and all these wonderful things. But I want you to know, on Sunday mornings, you need to be in the Church of England to receive the sacraments. You need to be receiving the Eucharist each Sunday. And that's where you go to receive the Eucharist, the Church of England. So the Methodist followers of Wesley did some of that, but a lot of times they just kind of gave up on the Church of England and did their own thing. Wesley himself, though, always remained a faithful clergy person in the Church of England till his dying day. He never did leave the Church of England. He thought there were serious problems with the Church of England, but he thought in terms of their doctrine, their theology, even their organization, he was on board with it. So he remained a faithful member of the Church of England his whole life. Now, at some point in Wesley's adult ministry, what year was it? It was about 1770s. He sent Francis Asbury to America. Francis Asbury was one of his Methodist lay preachers in England. Wesley sent Francis Asbury to America and said, offer them Christ. There's a famous painting of Wesley commissioning Asbury to go to Methodist, and it's entitled, Offer Them Christ. And I think that we recently had the 250th anniversary of John Wesley sending Francis Asbury to America. Anyway, Francis Asbury came to America. Lots of Methodist preachers from England went to America. They came to America before the Revolutionary War. During the Revolutionary War in the United States, or what became the United States, Methodist preachers were viewed with great suspicion because they were viewed as still faithful to England, to John Wesley. And John Wesley was politically, John Wesley was very conservative, faithful to the crown of England and the King of England. Now, in a lot of interesting ways, John Wesley was socially, he was not very conservative at all. He, in a number of ways, he strongly opposed slavery. He wrote some very strong words against particularly American slavery. England at the time was involved in slavery, the slave trade. He wrote a letter to William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament, who eventually stopped the slave trade in England. And his last letter, as a matter of fact, before he died, was to William Wilberforce. And he said, unless the Spirit of God has raised you up, Athanasius contra mundum, then you will be worn down by the devil. But if God has raised you up to put an end to slavery, then who will stand against you? And he inspired William Wilberforce, who was converted in some of the Wesleyan revival preachings. William Wilberforce eventually outlawed slavery in England. And Wesley was strongly in favor of that. Wesley was opposed to child labor. He wanted children in schools. That's why he built schools and orphanages. He was very, you would say, progressive about women's leadership for his day, although he never approached the subject of ordaining women, but he did believe in women's leadership and women's preaching. So in a number of social, he was opposed to gin houses and gin. He wasn't opposed to all alcoholic beverages because he drank wine and had wine at communion, obviously, but he was opposed to gin and gin houses because so many of the men in England were just wasting away their lives in these gin houses that made gin cheap gin that just destroyed families in towns and just left them devastated. And he was opposed to all that. So socially, he had a lot of progressive edges. But how did I get on that? Yeah, when Francis Asbury and the Methodist preachers were in America during the Revolutionary War, they kind of laid low because they were viewed with skepticism. That's right, because Wesley was loyal to the crown, and Methodists were not always. When they originally started preaching in America, they were good. Then when the American Revolutionary War came, they were viewed with suspicion. They pretty much laid low during the Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, Wesley realized the Methodists in America can no longer be members of the Church of England. And he believed so strongly in the sacraments that he wanted every Methodist, he really wanted every Christian to receive communion every Sunday. And he couldn't send them to the Church of England anymore because the English clergy had left, most of them, and had basically abandoned what we would now call Episcopal churches in the United States. So he eventually ordained Thomas Coke to come to America to ordain Francis Asbury and for them to be superintendents in the United States, which basically meant he authorized the formation of a separate church in America, which they called the Methodist Episcopal Church. Methodist Episcopal just means having bishops. We still have bishops today. So Methodism in America grew like wildfire. Right after the Revolutionary War, Francis Asbury, who was the presiding bishop of the Methodist Church, even though John Wesley didn't want them to use the term bishop, he just said, call yourself superintendent. But they eventually started calling themselves bishop, which John Wesley didn't particularly like, but tolerated it. But Francis Asbury presented George Washington, the first president of the United States, with a letter saying the Methodist Episcopal Church fully supports your new government. And when he did that, that kind of let the pressure off the Methodists so that we weren't viewed with so much suspicion, so that we would be more free to preach the gospel and have more acceptance in the general American society. So Methodism under Francis Asbury and many others grew. They had circuit riders. When nobody else wanted to go out west in the frontier and in the rough places of the country, Methodist preachers would go. And they would go riding their horses, and they were reading their Greek New Testaments while riding a horse, which is what John Wesley did too. And at one point in just before the Civil War, it was kind of documented that there were more Methodist churches in the United States than there were post offices. That's how thoroughly Methodism had penetrated into the new American country and continent. So there were lots of jingles. The devil hates the Methodists because they sing and shout the best. That's one of the jingles on the frontier. They had camp meetings. You know about camp meetings. The camp meetings that are here in Denver, what's it called? Rock Springs. I don't think Francis Asbury ever came to Rock Springs, but some people who had learned from Francis Asbury came to Rock Springs. Kind of a second generation of circuit riders. And Balls Creek, is that the other one? Yeah, they came from that era. And they were mass preaching sites with brush harbors. And that's how Methodism really grew in the 19th century in the United States. Now, just kind of as an aside, that was Methodism in the United States. It became known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. Again, Episcopal just means having bishops. In England, they were not part of what we called the Methodist Episcopal Church. They were part of the British Methodist Church, and they're still that today. They're not, so like today, we're called the United Methodist Church. The Methodists in England are not part of the United Methodist Church. They're kind of a separate denomination. They have the same Wesleyan history and roots, but they're a different denomination. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks, why that's key. So Methodism grew. This gets a little bit into next week. How much time do I have? Only 18 minutes. They grew because of their fiery preaching, their organization, and they also had a high view of the sacraments. And the preachers did not, because they had baptisms at some of these camp meetings. And the preachers, though, would have to travel. They didn't have enough preachers to go around, so that's how they had what we called circuit riders. And a preacher would have like a circuit in which there were 5 different preaching places that he would go, and it was mainly he, although there were some she, but mainly he would travel around. So he couldn't be at the church every week. He could only be at the church maybe once a month or sometimes once a quarter. But whenever he was there, he'd celebrate the sacraments. Now, later on, when we had enough Methodist clergy to go around, we had already gotten into a bad habit of not having communion every Sunday. And so that's why even today in Methodist churches, most Methodist churches don't have communion every Sunday. That goes back, there are historical reasons for that. We at Mount Zion are blessed because if you want to receive communion, you can receive communion every Sunday at our 8:30 service and once a month at our other services. But anyway, that's how Methodism grew. Taking it a little bit closer to present day, in the United States, Methodism split apart north and south about 15 years before the Civil War started. And of course, it was over the issue of slavery. John Wesley himself and the early Methodists opposed slavery, but later on, especially in the South, they made exceptions and they started allowing slave owners to have prominent positions in the church and eventually even bishops in the church. And at one general conference one year, mainly the Northern Church Methodists said, well, this person can't be a bishop, he owns slaves. And at that point, the Methodist Episcopal Church South came into existence in 1844, I believe it was. So the church split north and south. And also in the early to mid 1800s, there was another Methodist church that kind of split off called the Methodist Protestant Church. And they didn't split off because of slavery. They split off because they didn't want bishops. They just wanted congregations. And so instead of the Methodist Episcopal Church, they called themselves the Methodist Protestant Church. Anyway, so these 3 different versions of Methodism were, actually all 3 of them were growing. And they got back together in 1939. 1939, the Methodist Church came back to existence. It came from those 3 sources: the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Methodist Protestant Church came together in 1939 to form the Methodist Church. And the sad thing, though, about that was when they did that, they created something called the central jurisdiction. And that was that I'll get to this in a minute, the Black folks within the Methodist Church were not allowed to be a part of the wider structure. And we kind of put them in a separate jurisdiction. They would have their own bishop, they would have their own churches, but they wouldn't really mix with us. So that was part of the sin price that we had, this was in the Jim Crow era. And the Southern Church said, okay, in 1939, they said, okay, we'll get back with our other Methodist brethren and sisters, but only if we create this central jurisdiction where we keep all the blacks. And so we came back together in 1939, but there was a heavy price for that. But the central jurisdiction existed until 1968. In 1968, what they called the Methodist Church at the time kind of merged with something called the Evangelical United Brethren Church. This was a group of, it was mainly in the northern Pennsylvania Amish country. They had some Mennonite influence. They had some Amish influence, and they were called the United Brethren and the Evangelical Church, which came together to form the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And then in 1968, we joined with the Evangelical United Brethren Church to form what we now call the United Methodist Church, which is what we are today, which we've been around for 53 years now, the United Methodist Church. And one more thing I'll say, because this is about Methodism, not just United Methodism. There are other expressions of Methodism that are not part of what we call the United Methodist Church. There is the AME Church. It was started in 1787. That's African Methodist Episcopal Church. It started in Philadelphia at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. Basically, some blacks came. And they were told they had to sit separately, that you have to sit up in the balcony. You can't sit down in the main sanctuary with the white folks. And they were basically kicked out. And in 1787, Richard Allen was one of their leaders. And Richard Allen had been in 1784 at the Christmas conference that had ordained Francis Asbury when the whole denomination started anyway. Richard Allen was there. But then a mere 3 years later, he was kicked out of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And when he left, he didn't come back. He just said, well, we'll start a different church. And that's how the AME Church started, African Methodist Episcopal Church. They're still in existence today. They came out of Philadelphia. Also, in 1821, the AME Zion Church came into existence, another black denomination. They came out of St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church in New York City. They had a similar experience of basically being kicked out of the Methodist Church. And so they started their own church. That started in New York City in 1821. And those churches are still in existence today. Now, in modern day discussions about Methodist movements, and as we think about our history, there are times when we say, hey, we need to get back together with our AME friends and our AME Zion friends and come all together as Methodists, because we need to repent of our history of racism, and we need to come back together. I mean, we're all trace our theological roots back to John Wesley. And we need to come back together. And there have been some of those discussions, but it's so complicated. Once you've got that over 100-year history, once another church has already established their organization, their financial structure, their ministerial structure, it's hard just to tell them, hey, drop everything you've been doing and come back with us. Yeah, we kicked you out 100 years ago, and we know that you've been doing all these things for the last 100 years, but now you just need to forget all that and come back to us. That is not easy to do. So while we still try to be in relationship with the AME Church and the AME Zion Church, we have not yet come to an organic unity with them yet. We're certainly open to that, but we haven't. There are just too many so far, at least. There are just too many. So many complicating factors. But despite that, we're encouraged to do as much as we can with our fellow Methodists from AME and AME Zion backgrounds. We're certainly in full communion with them, which means we accept their ordination. We can celebrate communion with them. They can come preach in our church. I can come preach in their church. So we're in full communion with them. but we haven't yet achieved an organic reunification with them yet. I hope we will someday, but there are just so many legal issues, property issues, other things. Next week, we're going to talk some about polity in the United Methodist Church. Do you know who owns this building that we're in right now? Yeah, the Western North Carolina Annual Conference. That's a polity issue. That's one of the things I'll talk about next week. Actually, there are historical reasons for that. John Wesley, when he first started the Methodist societies, before we were ever a church, they did build some chapels, some preaching chapels. And he wrote into the deeds of those Methodist preaching chapels what's called the trust clause. And he said, okay, I'll entrust you with this capital, this chapel, but I want you to know I really own it, John Wesley said. The reason for that is because he wanted to make sure that it was really Methodist doctrine that was always going to be taught in those chapels. He didn't want somebody else preaching non-Methodist doctrine in it. So he wanted to have control of the property rights of it. Well, he realized later that's probably a mistake for one person to own all that stuff. And that's kind of an invitation to self-deception and ego for one person to own all those different chapels. So he entrusted that into what he called the Legal 100, which was a group of 100 Methodist lay preachers who together owned all these chapels. And there was some local ownership of the chapels, but they always owned it in trust for the wider whole. And even today in the Methodist Church, that's the historical precedent for it. Even today in the Methodist Church, like our board of trustees are legally responsible for our property and have somewhat control over it. But when push comes to shove, who really owns the property? The conference does, and they entrust it to us. That's called the trust clause. That's in the deed of every Methodist church in the United States, every United Methodist Church in the United States. That's going to become significant when we look at some other issues later down the line. I've talked for a long time. I've talked for too long. What questions might y'all have? Where'd the money come from? Yeah. Oh. Yeah, that's why he was in debtor's prison. He didn't have much money. I don't really know. John Wesley lived his whole life with hardly any money at all. When he died, the only thing he had that he owned were the clothes on his back and a Bible and a tea kettle. Well, yeah, by that time it had passed on to the Legal 100, thank goodness. And that's one reason, because, they didn't want the ownership rights to get all tangled up with just him personally. That's one reason he passed it on to what he called the Legal 100. So he didn't own that. And even when he technically owned it, he didn't do anything with it except make sure that it was Methodist doctrine being taught there. But the Methodist societies would take up collections. They would. And as a matter of fact, the teacher for the classes was responsible for getting a collection from everybody. Most of that money, though, went to the poor and to orphanages and to established schools. Some of it was used to, build these chapels or some other kind of institutional maintenance. But Methodism started out poor. And Wesley there's a famous quote for John Wesley who said, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he said, he had a sermon on the use of money. And he said, we Methodists need to watch ourselves. This is why. Most of us started out poor, because he started out with the common people. Most of them were poor. He said, but once they get converted, they start acting like Christians. They're not wasting their money anymore. They start to become frugal. And Wesley encouraged them to Earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. Those are the three rules about money. Earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. And but he said, as Methodists start to grow, they acquire some money, and he said we need to watch it, because once we start building buildings, then we become dependent on wealthy people. And when that happens, so much for Methodist discipline and doctrine. Because we become dependent on wealthy people to keep us subsidized. And he just thought that was an unhealthy dynamic. So he didn't want us to have that much money. He himself didn't have that much money. But later on, after his death, 100 years after his death, Methodist has as much money as any of the other churches. And we began to kind of grow socially. And that, not all of that was healthy. There was some good to that, because we could use that money to do mission with and do good things with. But sometimes it went to our heads, and we got a little bit too much taken with ourselves. And we forgot that the purpose of all of this is to reach people for Christ, to love our neighbor, to serve the poor. And there was actually, you know how the Salvation Army got started? By William Booth. He was an early Methodist. Salvation Army grew out of Methodism by William Booth. He was a Methodist preacher, and he saw, shortly after Wesley's death, he saw the Methodists, we're getting away from our emphasis on serving the poor. And after that went on for a few years, he saw what's happening, became very cautious about it, and he kind of pulled out and he started the Salvation Army. But he started out as a Methodist, and he became suspicious or dissatisfied when Methodism started distancing itself from the poor. And that's how the Salvation Army started. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are Methodists, but there are some Baptists too, I think. And I think this was actually a recent legal question that, did it come up with? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, they're. But the Browns are by the conference, and the preacher that's with the Fairfield. Yep, that's right. Is designated preacher. That's right. That's right. Yep. And when and they have those tents, which are like barns or shacks or whatever you. Right. And when I was a young seminary student at Duke, my first field ed assignment was with the pastor at Fairfield. And that's when I was first exposed to the camp meetings there. And yeah. But yeah, those camp meetings, a lot of them do have ties to the Methodist Church, and a lot are owned by the conference. Not all of them, though. Not all of them. Yes. What other questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Her father actually taught her. Yeah, which was, and you think even a generation before John Wesley, Susanna Wesley was being educated by her father, who was a dissenter minister. But he wanted to teach his daughters as much as his sons, and he did, which was very unusual for the day. And again, I think all that influenced Wesley a lot, and that's one reason why he allowed for female leadership in early Methodism in a way that the only other church group that was doing that was the Quakers in England. And when people wanted to insult Methodism, they had a variety of different ways they could do it. But one of them was to call it a women's movement. And they called Methodism a women's movement. And there's actually some truth in that, because there were a lot of the early, of course, Methodists were women, and there were some women in leadership positions that they wouldn't have had in other churches.
What kind of dissenter was he?
What kind of dissenter was Samuel Wesley's, or actually Samuel Wesley and also Susanna Wesley's father? I'm not sure about that, Amy. I would have to look that up and do some research. That's an interesting question. I'll have to look that up. I know that I think that Susanna Wesley's father was a dissenter and was a Calvinist, and Susanna reacted against that, which is one reason that she taught Arminianism to her children, and Methodism became an Arminian denomination to this day. But I'm not sure about what kind of dissenter Susanna Wesley's father was. I'll look that up. That'd be an interesting question. Yeah. Any other questions? We've already gone past our time. Y'all have been so good and attentive, and I feel like I talk too much, and I'd love to hear your questions. So next week, we've talked mainly about history today. Next week, we'll look at practice and theology of Methodism, and included in that will be some of our worship practices, why we do what we do in worship, and as well as some of our official doctrinal statements, our view of the sacraments, and our understanding of grace, threefold understanding of grace, and a few other Methodist theological beliefs that we'll talk about next week. Okay? Thank you all so much. Next week, and I have this conflict, I'm going to be here next week, and I hope most of you will be too. But next week, the C.S. Lewis movie is coming out for one night only. So, and it's Wednesday night of next week at 7:00. So I will give you permission not to be here next week, if and only if you're at the C.S. Lewis movie. Other than that, you're not excused. No, but the C.S. Lewis movie is one night next Wednesday night at 7:00. It'll be in Birkdale. But I'm just decided that I'm just going to wait and see it once it comes out on DVD or streaming or whatever. But that'll be interesting. But I know there's a group from the church that's already planning on going to see the C.S. Lewis movie next Wednesday night. And there's some interesting, actually, analogies between C.S. Lewis and Wesley. Although they're very different, they had some similarities too. And we can talk about that sometime. But anyway, good night and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Amy, for tuning in tonight.
Thank you.
And I will see you again later. I'm going to stop this recording now.
All right, have a good night.